Hello. Welcome for everybody who's joining us. Welcome to this energy conversation for the Texas-Mexico Center's 5th Annual Symposium. I'm Jenia Purdy. I am the manager of the center. We're really glad to have you here, and we're really excited to have our guests here. We're going to have a fantastic conversation, and it's my great honor to introduce these speakers for you. We have James Coleman, who is our faculty board member and our research fellow. He is also a professor here at Dedman School of Law and has been researching energy for many, many years. James, we are so happy to have you. Thank you so much for being here. Guillermo Garcia Sanchez, who's an associate professor at Texas A&M University School of Law, and also working on a research project for our center, so also our research fellow for the Texas-Mexico Center. Thank you so much for joining us. And Enrique Marroquin, our Executive Vice President of Strategic Development for Zaro Transportation, also greatly following the activity from our center. Thank you for always supporting us and being so involved, and also someone who comes with years of experience in the energy sector, having served as president of Hunt Mexico for many years. Gentlemen, welcome. We are really happy to have you here. And I'm just going to remind our guests that you can use the Q&A feature right there on your screen. We will be having some Q&A at the end of this session. But right now, let's leave you to this conversation. What is the panorama for energy between Texas and Mexico? And because what happens in Texas and Mexico matters to North America, I would say North America. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, please allow me to, I'm just going to share my screen here to share a few slides with you all. So, and I will have to go back. All right. Apologies. There we are. So the topic for today obviously is Texas and Mexico's energy relationship and how that sits at the center of the increasingly energy trade within North America. So apologies, let me just make sure. Can I get a thumbs up from y'all just to indicate that y'all have this? You're seeing the slides. Good, great. Okay. So, and you can see the full version, not the presenter version. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, great. So, in any event, and so this is a project that Guillermo and I have been working on. The basic background is that, of course, the Texas and Mexico energy trading relationship is one of the most important energy trading relationships in the world. And in fact, this trilateral relationship of energy trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico those are probably the most important bilateral energy trading relationships in the world. And often, there's historically been a focus on that trade between the US and Canada. That remains incredibly important, is actually growing more important year by year. As you see, in that dark blue color, those exports of and imports of oil to the United States and from the United States. With Canada, you see that incredibly important natural gas trading relationship, which historically the US has gotten natural gas from Canada, but now is sending a lot of natural gas back to Canada, almost a third of what it receives. And also with electric power being traded across the border, and power within North America tends to flow south from cheap hydro supplies. But what we're going to focus on today is that important relationship between the United States and Mexico, which is, again, growing more important year by year. And there are several aspects to it. Historically, of course, oil from Mexico helped drive the American economy, and that demand in the United States was, important source, market for producers of oil in Mexico. And it remains the case that the United States imports crude from Mexico, including heavy crude. The U.S. has a lot of refineries that are set up for heavy crude. But what's happened in the past decade is that we've had, increasing natural gas exports to Mexico. So if you look at pipeline natural gas in the United States, exports and imports, for years, the US was a major net importer. Now, between its exports to Canada and about, especially to Mexico, there's about twice as much exported to Mexico as to Canada. It's now about net zero on pipeline exports. So it's a truly massive amount of export. If you were looking at global bilateral relationships in natural gas exports, Canada and the United States would be number one. Unless you count the EU as a bloc, and Mexico and the United States would be number two. So it's an incredibly important relationship. You'll also see the export of refined products. So the United States imports a lot of crude oil from Mexico, but exports refined products, gasoline, and other products to Mexico. You see a growing transport of electricity. That was, that transport of electricity is a future opportunity. If you look at the renewable resources within Mexico, a lot of their wind resources are in Tamaulipas and would be most valuable if they could be exported to Texas. And so there's an opportunity for increased electricity transport as well. But for now, a lot of it is on the oil and gas, and of course, then the finished petroleum products side. So there's both been a massive increase in transport and in opportunities for new transport. And this really presents a lot of win-win opportunities for both sides. We know that, in Texas, we have a pretty low cost power system that with the recent exception has historically been quite reliable. And we will talk about that exception. But and then in northern Mexico, often less reliable electricity, and it's often not as clean in terms of its sources as the mix of natural gas and renewable power that we have in Texas. So if you were able to create, a connected grid or a similar grid in northern Mexico, it would be a huge advantage in terms of both lowering the cost of electricity, increasing its reliability, and lowering the environmental cost of the power system. So and I should note that this chart is from 2017. These exports, for the most part, continue to grow. So the relationship has just gotten more important year by year. And so when I use those natural gas statistics, often I'm using the more recent BP statistics on that international energy trade. So incredible opportunity in terms of markets and the policy goals of affordable and clean, reliable energy. On the other hand, if we look at the legal landscape, what we see is growing threats to energy trade. And I'm going to say something about those growing threats in the United States on this side of the border, and Guillermo will speak a little bit about some of the growing threats in Mexico and the Mexican legal system. So one threat is an increasingly extended, partisan, and unstable pipeline approval process. Now, we're seeing that show up in a lot of respects. In some ways, the pipeline boom that in the past decade enabled increased natural gas exports to Mexico sort of got right under the, under the radar, it got across the finish line before some of the pipeline wars really exploded in the United States. And I think, we can be grateful for that in terms of the continuing relationship of energy trade between the United States and Mexico. But if you're looking at the long-term future of that and hoping that there will be additional infrastructure to support that continuing energy relationship, it's looking harder and harder. And so, when I talk about a fickle, unstable process, I think that one example that we'd often look to is the Keystone XL process, right? That was a pipeline that had its first application in 2008. Here we are 13 years later. It has had several environmental reviews. All have said very positive things about the pipeline. A minimum impact on the environment, may even reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And nonetheless, that has been repeatedly delayed. And we see a little bit of the asymmetry in energy infrastructure where the previous administration tried to get that pipeline built for 4 years and was not able to, even though it had been under review for years with all these positive environmental reviews. And the new administration is able to come in on day one and kill it. And I think that's something we're seeing in energy infrastructure across the United States, is an asymmetry where it's very difficult for president to get his priorities built in terms of infrastructure, whether it's pipelines, high-speed rail, power lines for clean energy, but it's very easy to kill infrastructure. And so I think that's a concern potentially going forward. President Biden, during the campaign, said that he would end all oil and gas permitting on federal lands and waters, which would, in theory, include pipeline permits. Whether he'll actually follow through with that, I don't know. I'm at Energy Law Prof on Twitter. I've been following just before, as we got into this. Right now, the Biden administration is speaking to a DC court on its position on the Dakota Access Pipeline. It looks like it's going to allow that to continue to operate for now, but that very much hangs in the balance. And the reality is, we don't know how the Biden administration will address all of these both legacy energy projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline that were already built, plus new pipeline projects going forward. And that is an issue also between the United States and Canada with that have signed the Pipeline Transit Treaty, which is supposed to protect transit of oil through one of these member countries. And people have looked to as a model for an energy treaty between neighbors. Another obviously one is the Energy Charter Treaty with Europe, with the European Union. We're and Guillermo and I are looking at that kind of model as well. So there's some other threats that you see is increasing scrutiny on pipelines for energy export as well as power lines. Under the US Constitution, you only can exercise eminent domain to build linear infrastructure if it's for a public use. And there's been increasing questions whether exporting energy commodities constitutes a public use that would allow eminent domain. That was sort of taken for granted for a long time, but there weren't that many energy exports. As there have been more and more energy, as the US becomes a net energy exporter, and as we're transporting energy longer distances, that has increasingly been put in question, challenged in states around the United States, as well as challenged in the federal government. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the courts. That's very much at issue in several cases right now. And finally, of course, with the Texas power outage, one aspect that many maybe in Texas didn't pay sufficient attention to was that, in addition to the power outages in Texas, there were also power outages in northern Mexico, because northern Mexico is dependent on natural gas from Texas for its power. With the blackout and the shortage of natural gas, you saw exports to Mexico dropping significantly. And then on top of that, the governor, a couple days into the crisis, issued an order forbidding exports unless the gas had been offered to domestic power suppliers first. And, I think one reason that, as a policy matter, Mexico was more comfortable than one might be with integrating its energy system is that, it didn't really think the US would act like Russia and just cut off, again, in this fickle matter, cut off energy exports. But that's potentially put in question if the Texas governor just feels free to, whenever he wants, turn off natural gas exports to northern Mexico. And so that is a really important issue going forward about whether Texas is a reliable energy trading partner, free market energy trading partner as it's been advertised. Finally, I think it's important to look at, there's increasing pushes for carbon tariffs around the world, how that would impact regional energy trade. It's sort of ironic. Canada is pretty far ahead of the other NAFTA partners in carbon pricing. On the other hand, the United States has been the most aggressive at suggesting, well, as soon as they have a carbon price, they intend to apply border carbon adjustments or carbon tariffs. And both of those things could have significant impacts on North American energy trade. So with that, I'll turn it over to Guillermo to talk about some of the other threats, and then we'll kind of bring it back together for some potential solutions.
Thank you, James. And well, as many of you imagine, this is like a moving target because, since we started this project, we've had changes in administration on both sides of the border, and that has changed a lot of the initial findings that we had. So in the case of Mexico, as you know, Mexico had a new president that came into power right in the middle of all this energy integration process that was happening. And President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has always been open about his views of the energy sector in Mexico. Now, some of you might not be aware that in 2013, Mexico basically opened up its energy sector to private investment. In the electricity side, they allowed private actors to start producing electricity and sell it in the wholesale market. CFE, which is a state-owned company, still had the monopoly over the transmission and distribution, but at least the production side, there was a competition market. I mean, private parties could come from abroad, and they did come in hordes, and especially for renewable energy, they started to participate in building wind farms and installing solar panels in order to sell that electricity. On the hydrocarbon side, Mexico, for the first time since the Mexican expropriation and Mexican Revolution, allowed private parties to participate in the E&P sector, so exploration and production of hydrocarbons. So only now in Mexico, you had several rounds where private companies came over, especially for deep water fields in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were able to secure some blocks and start producing under different types of contracts. And I'm happy to go into detail in the Q&A, but we don't have time. So all those two things, the opening of the E&P sector and the electricity production sector, the President López Obrador has, during his campaign, he always said he was reluctant, right? Reluctant, why? Because he has a vision of the energy sector where energy sovereignty reigns. It's a very loose term. Bear with me. We were trying to figure out what they actually mean by energy sovereignty. So from different speeches that they've given and some of the policies they've taken, we can at least identify a couple of elements of what energy sovereignty goals are. So one of them is we're trying to avoid any rise in energy tariffs, right? So having more control, in their view, that they can benefit the Mexican consumer and keeping tariffs low. Reduce dependence on imports of natural gas and refined products from abroad. So after what James showed you in a couple of minutes ago, Mexico has been expanding its interaction with the US, and it goes both ways around. Mexico sells crude oil, but at the same time, it's importing refined products and it's importing gasoline. Why? Because Mexico the previous administration was supposed to building new refineries. They thought, well, Texas refineries, especially the ones located in Houston, they are already equipped to refine Mexican sour crude, which is, it's high in sulfur. And so why build a new refinery, especially for a market that down the line, they already knew there was going to be less demand for crude with a high component of sulfur, So why do a refinery for a market that we know is going to look? So let's use existing capacities in Texas. And so Mexico has been importing a lot of gasoline. So that's the two views. And same thing with gas. They've been very open of saying that they want to reduce their dependency on gas from Texas. Another policy goal is revisiting energy contracts that are not seen as sufficiently beneficial to the state. This is a very weird argument from the legal standpoint, because they are arguing actually that the contracts that were signed by the previous administration were unconscionable. This basically means that they were very one-sided. For those of you that are not lawyers, it's a very hard argument to make that the contract is one-sided when you drafted the contract, right? When the state drafted the contract and invited the companies under those terms, it's hard to say that they are one-sided because it was the state who sided it, right? Usually, the party that argues unconscionability is the one that is in the lower end of the bargaining position, right? It's usually the companies. But in this case, it's the government saying, oh, they're one-sided. It's another way of saying that they're basically corrupt contracts, but they are not, they haven't found so far any grounds to allege that the officials that signed those kind of contracts where there was any corruption or there was any influence in the signing or drafting of the contract. So unless they can prove that, and then the argument would be they're illegal because there was corruption involved, it's very hard to make an argument of unconscionability when the government actually is the one who drafted the contract. So, but that's one of the arguments. The other goal is to increase CFEs. That's the, again, the power utilities, the utility company in Mexico, and increase its market share to 54%. And what does that mean? Right now with the energy reform, CFE, the way the dispatch of energy is done in Mexico, it's the one that is at the lowest cost, right? So right now, for example, renewables are able to dispatch their power first, because they are producing at lower cost than CFE. And that's one of the things that they want to change. They want to make sure that first the CFE electricity is being dispatched as opposed to the private parties. And then finally is boost PEMEX output. So this is the, let's make PEMEX great again. PEMEX was a giant in the past, and we want to make it a giant again. As many of you know, PEMEX production has going down since 1996, I would say, when Cantarell peaked, and then it started depleting and it kept going down. Part of that has to do with the fact that Pemex has a lot of inefficiencies, and they haven't been able to invest in more exploration. So that's one of the reasons why they invited private parties to participate in the E&P sector. And as part of that whole goal of energy sovereignty is they want to build a new refinery, again, to depend less on the imports from Texas. And they're building a new refinery that is costing them, well, they said it's going to cost them $6 billion, probably it's going to be more in the numbers of the 10 or perhaps even more in Tabasco, in Dos Bocas, Tabasco, which is also dubious. So what concrete policies that they've taken are they connected to these goals? The first one and the newest ones is they've enacted a new electricity legislation where basically we are reinstating again CFE's monopoly over electricity generation. They're going to be first dispatching all of the CFE's power plants, that many of them are based on gas and some of them are based on oil. They're burning oil in order to produce. The other thing that they've done, they forced the renegotiation of the gas pipelines. That was one of the first actions they took against foreign companies. All these pipelines that were bringing gas from Texas, they were renegotiated. They were able to lower the tariff, but expand the timeline. So the Mexican auditor came out and said, actually, this is going to cost Mexico more. But in the short run, it was a gain under their view. They have done a permit paralysis for private parties. So the independent regulators received a memo from the president saying that they should stop issuing any new permits to the private entities and only issue permits for CFE and Pemex. And then they also canceled all the E&P bidding rounds that were planned. One of them was actually in the Burgos Basin to produce more shale, to produce shale gas. So that could have been an option to stop the importing of Texas gas, but they decided to cancel that. And then the last one, that this is actually happening on Friday before Easter, it was they proposed a new hydrocarbons legislation that extends the power of the Ministry of Energy to intervene in the hydrocarbons infrastructure. So that basically means they can take over. Some are saying that it's setting the grounds for an expropriation, because basically now it's under their discretion. They can actually take over storage facilities by private parties. They can hold the permits of private parties, and that's, you know, in and itself could be seen as an expropriation if that happens. So what has been the reaction on the US side? So basically, even all the way back from, there's a consensus. This is one of the few areas where both Democrats and Republicans agree. So even when Trump was still in power, the US legislators, a bipartisan letter was sent to Trump asking Trump to get involved in the energy sector in Mexico and defend the energy companies against what was happening. And then again, the same thing happened when Biden took over office. Actually, you know, the new Secretary of State, that was one of the first conversations that they had, even though during the private Biden-AMLO meeting, they didn't mention it because the Mexican government was very reluctant to having a conversation about the energy. But we know that the State Department has been pushing on that issue. So the big question here is, what happens to the USMCA, right? They sold us a USMCA that was originally signed by the previous administration, by the Peña Nieto administration, Trump and Trudeau. That negotiation started in 2017 and 2018 when the US threatened to get out of NAFTA, the NAFTA to 1994. Then it was revised again in 2019 when the new administration came in power in Mexico, and then entered into force in July 2020. So AMLO came right in the middle of the renegotiation, right when the Democrats were trying to figure out what elements they wanted to include. And one of the things that AMLO was able to do was they took away an energy chapter. And that is a very important point. There was an energy chapter included, that was chapter 8. They took it away and they created chapter 8, the recognition of Mexico's sovereign right over hydrocarbons. And basically what it's doing, the way I call it, I describe it, is like a placebo article, right? It's a placebo chapter because it's not saying anything new out there. There have been several international resolutions from the UN and treaties that recognize that every state basically has a right to exploit its natural resources according to its own laws. I mean, so that is not new, but that's what the chapter 8 is saying. But an important caveat is that the chapter 8 is also saying that that recognition of Mexico's right to develop its resources in any way leases, especially the hydrocarbon resources, cannot be done without prejudice of the existing rights and remedies afforded by the treaty. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So the US and Canada said, okay, if Mexico wants to keep their energy chapter aside, we are going to sign our own energy chapter, right? So they signed, US and Canada did sign a side letter where basically it's setting up principles of free market. You cannot discriminate access to energy infrastructure for Canadians in the US. You have to have independent regulators, and any action, and this is important connected to the Texas blackout, any action taken by one of the parties has to take into consideration, it has to be non-discriminatory, has to take into consideration any contracts that might be affected, right? And it has to be done in a transparent way. So those are the elements in the treaty. What other elements in the treaty were left that affect the energy industry that I think are important to recognize? So Chapter 2, for example, updated market access exemptions. So Chapter 2, basically, under the NAFTA 1994, Mexico reserved the right to deny export and import permits in the for hydrocarbons. Under the new Chapter 2, Mexico still reserves the right to approve the export permits, but it has to be done in a non-discriminatory way, in a transparent way. So you are adding caveats into the limits that Mexican government can do. And this is important because it's one of the elements that also is being changed now. Chapter 4, rules of origin, it basically makes it easier to move products around the region because now it allows up to 40% of crude, for example, to be from a non-originating country. That is very important, for example, for the Canadians. They want to mix with lighter crude, or the crude that is being produced in the tar sands. It's easier to move it around. Before, they basically had to prove that it was all Canadian, so they couldn't mix it up in Canada. They had to wait until it was shipped to the refineries. And then Chapter 14 creates an investor rights only for US companies investing in Mexico, and it creates an investor state dispute resolution mechanism for contracts signed with the Mexican government. And so this is very important because they were able to stick, even though they passed Chapter 8, they were able to sneak in their remedies available for all the US companies invested in the energy sector, both hydrocarbons, electricity, telecommunications, and transportation, construction and transportation projects. So those are protected. And now they did another interesting thing. They included Article 32.11 that basically sends the signal that Mexico cannot adopt more restrictive measures than the ones Mexico has pledged to in other treaties. And this is basically saying you have to look at other treaties that Mexico signed in order to figure out whether Mexico can take restrictive measures against trade and investors. And in that sense, the Trans-Pacific Progressive Trade Agreement is very important because Mexico included in the reservations basically the energy reform. They said, we're not going to take any other measures that are more restrictive than the ones we already afforded to investors in the energy reform. So the energy reform basically is integrated in the back door of the USMCA to Article 32.11. Other elements are interesting in there that affect also the energy industry. It's technical barriers to trade. So basically that means Mexico has the obligation to revise its regulation and lower and find out less restrictive regulation that benefits the trading partner. So you have to lower the standards to make it less restrictive in order to sponsor more trade. Then you have Chapter 28, also good regulatory practices, make it more transparent, less discriminatory, with a process of consultation. And then Chapter 28 that sets up the environmental standards. And I'm happy to go into detail about those because basically they integrated a bunch of multilateral environmental related agreements. And one of the questions with the Biden administration now is whether they're going to also integrate the Paris Agreement, right, into those obligations that are now covered under the USMCA. So these are not all bad news. One of the things that we're finding in the paper and in our research is that even, let's say, all these things continue to happen, the region is so integrated and there are so many chains of value that have been created that even if we go to a more state-centered policies, there are ways in which Mexico, Texas, and generally the US can benefit, right? So just to give you very quick examples. For example, Mexico could use this existing pipeline infrastructure to bring natural gas from Texas and export it to the Asian markets. It's easier for all the reasons that James just explained. to use that infrastructure than to build pipelines that go from Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and then export it to Asian markets, or ship it through the Panama Canal, right? That's more expensive. Why don't we use existing infrastructure, see if it could benefit, they could charge a fee. That gas is not going to affect the Mexican market because it's always going to be shipped to Asia. So there are opportunities there. Of course, there are opportunities there. The same thing, for example, if let's say Biden administration cancels all the new projects for shale production in federal lands, that is going to move a lot of producers, especially from New Mexico, that they could actually work in Mexico if Mexico allows them to go and do projects, service contracts with Pemex to produce the Burgos Basin that is very close to the Texas border, has very similar characteristics to Eagle Ford. So you could benefit from that opportunity if you were just sit down and think about it. Third opportunity, the Gulf of Mexico. You have a bunch of infrastructure that was built on the US side to exploit deep water fields, and you have on the Mexican side no infrastructure built, right? If Mexico and the US could sit down and figure out how you can tap on existing infrastructure on the US side, Mexico would save a lot of money, and the efficiencies are there. It's just a matter of sitting down and thinking about it. And that has nothing to do with energy sovereignty or anything like that. There are business opportunities that could help. So those are my three examples of opportunities. I don't know if James wants to add anything else before we jump.
The only thing I would say is that I think one thing that we're seeing is that there are very short windows where reform is possible and cooperation on both sides of the border. And so I think it's really important to be developing, potential solutions, ways to encourage not just trade, but also energy policy cooperation. You want to have those on the shelf. So when that window of opportunity shows up where you can get something done, we have those ideas. I think one of the ambitions of our projects is to put those policy solutions on the shelf so that next time we get a window of opportunity, we can take advantage of it.
Do I jump in now? Is it my turn?
Yeah, I hope we gave you enough.
No, we love your thoughts.
Thank you. James and Guillermo, very interesting points, and you basically hitting the nail in the head so many times that was so busy taking notes on the things that right now are affecting and supporting the bilateral relationship. And I would say that the probably from the perspective of the researcher, as both of you are, this is probably the best time that one can hope for to get the research done, because there's so much fluidity and so much volatility in the political environment and the binational environment that I think it's prone to sprout many things, many topics. Now, if everything were working well, it would probably be too boring. And now that the things are so, I would say, chaotic, for lack of a better word, I think it's the best time to be here. Despite what some of the people south of the border think, they're not enjoying very much all this volatility in the political environment. But from the business side, from the investor side, I'd say that what's going on in Mexico right now and the relationship between Texas and Mexico, it's probably not the best of times, and it's definitely not the best of times. What investors, from the investor point of view, and the private sector point of view, what we want is to understand the rules of the game. It's sometimes people misconstruct the objectives of investors as, they want to have their cake and eat it. Yeah, of course, there's people that want to have their cake and eat it, but typically the investor, particularly the U.S. investor, what they want to know is, I want to understand the rules of the game. I want to understand how can I make money. I want to understand if I invest, what are my recourses if something goes wrong? How can I fight? How can I take my case and plead it to the courts? And of course, I want to know how fast can I recover my money and how much money can I recover. Once I understand that, then I can make a decision if I want to take political risks, the country risks, the security risks, all the other risks are implied in the investment environment. And so in Mexico, sometimes people don't understand that that's what the U.S. investor wants. And sometimes what people in Mexico want is they want the U.S. investor to side by the Mexican private sector and in their plea, on their plight, to convince the government that what they're doing is not right. And I think that's something that we ought not to miss, right? That the objectives are somewhat different sometimes. At the end, all investors, what they want is to invest the money and get an appropriate return for their investment and risk adjusted. And of course, to invest in a safe place and in a socially and sustainable manner. So having said that, what's going on right now is a dislocation of that framework, because the rules of the game are changing with the morning press conferences. Every Monday, every Tuesday, the rules of the game change. And that's what I think is creating all the anxiety in this side of the border on the U.S. side, because I made assumptions, I made a plan, I convinced the board to invest in Mexico or to continue operating in Mexico, and now I have to go back to the board and convince them that okay, situation's changed, but we can still make money. And then 6 months later, I have to go back and tell them again that, well, guess what I told you 6 months ago is not anymore applicable, and now we have to reset the whole model. So that's creating a lot of anxiety, and since money is fungible, the investor can invest their money in the U.S. And as an aside, I wonder how and if the current proposal by President Biden passes. Not if, I'm sure it's going to pass, but in what form, in what amount. How is that going to change, or how is that going to affect the appetite for U.S. investors that would say, well, do I focus my investments in Mexico versus do I focus my investments in a territory that I know? I know the risk, and I same language, and I know the courts and the judicial system. So I think that's something that unfortunately on the Mexico side probably wasn't processing the decision-making machine down in Mexico City, that, oh my God, now there's going to be now competition for that capital. Forget about South America or Africa, or it's going to be competition for that capital here in the U.S. or Texas. And I think as industry, the frustration as well, besides the changing of the rules of the game, has been we can't communicate with the government. The industry participants in Mexico, at least, have not been able to communicate with the government for whatever reason. I'm not going to be judgmental on why, but there hasn't been that dialogue established. It's been haphazard, and it's working one day or the other. And I think that the academic sector, the think tanks, the universities, research centers, professors, experts in the matter, I think can provide that bridge, by presenting unbiased policy recommendations and research that could help the government in Mexico, at least, or the decision makers in Mexico, and also here in the U.S., make the decisions that they need to make on their own. They don't have somebody, i.e. the private sector or even the U.S., lobbying to change or not change a certain construct, because then that means that I might be perceived as weak. And in the case of Mexico right now, you have a very strong-willed president that does not want to show any signs of weakness, and particularly in light of the elections that are coming up. And so how do we help the government make the right decisions? And I think one way is to basically present good, solid policy recommendations that can help the staff and the different secretaries process those recommendations and eventually say, okay, this makes sense. For instance, just to cite, James, I think it was you that cited the amount of gas that's being imported by Mexico is 4+ BCF per day. What I'm going to say doesn't really apply, because you cannot suddenly stop importing gas the next day. But if you bear with me with this example, if you suddenly stopped importing gas, if Mexico suddenly started importing gas from Texas, what would happen to the price of the gas here in Texas? And what would happen to all those production wells? I mean, there's no way that that gas can be stored, all that gas. I mean, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of days, but there's no way. So that means, in my mind, in my armchair economics position, that the price is going to collapse, right? So that's one of the many things that for instance, in Mexico, people think that could happen, right? When you start importing gas, we can gain additional leverage, which is not exactly the case. But that shows us a symbiotic relationship between the industries. The question I pose is, are the policies, whether they're state or federal, in both sides, reflective of that symbiotic relationship? And I think the answer is no, right? Those contracts, the export contracts, the transportation contracts, they have probably some framework, some legal framework that supports. That's the reason why those pipelines were built in the first place and the contracts were signed. But I don't think it reflects that symbiotic relationship, i.e., if the governor decides to not send the gas to Mexico, that's his prerogative, perhaps, but Mexico thought otherwise. But what is that policy construct reflective of that relationship, right? If we're going to depend, if Texas industry demonstrates to Mexico through good policy and through good diplomacy that it's better for Mexico not to spend billions of dollars developing their own gas industry, but rather depend on the excess gas that's being produced in Texas. And if you're in the Mexico side, okay, what guarantees are you going to give me that this event is not going to happen again? What is there some way that you have NAFTA, I mean USMCA, and you might have other sorts of regulation, but is that enough? Because if not, if you put yourself in the shoes of the president in Mexico, his responsibility. He has to he has to deliver, right? He cannot say, well, no, the gas was not sent by governor such and such from such and such state. He has to take action, right? And what is the action that he's going to take? Well, he's going to try to develop the local industry. And one can argue, well, that creates jobs, that creates a local industry. That's perfect. The question is that the right use for the capital, right? Is that an efficient use of the capital? Is there a different use for that capital? And the answer is probably yes, because all that money has already been invested on the Texas side. But how do you extend those certainties? And I don't know, it might be politically impossible, but those are the things that cross my mind. In the electricity side, it's the same. I'm more familiar with the electricity side, but it's even more acute because during the last storm that we suffered here in Texas, not a lot of people know that Mexico was supporting the South Texas side by providing up to 400 megawatts of power when the system was already on the brink of collapsing here. And then I know we're being recorded, and maybe not in brink of collapse, but it was suffering dearly. And then Mexico stopped. Why? Because our plants froze, because they had their own policies on there. Not policy, they have their own political objectives. And the same applies in some situations where, when Texas is selling power to Mexico, there's a situation in Texas locally that the current policies and procedures have not contemplated. The first one that's going to be curtailed is the Mexican side, and Mexico is already counting on that power, right? They're already, the way electricity works, you're counting ahead on that power because you probably don't have that power to start with. You don't have those 400 megawatts because a unit was down, a transmission line was not operating, or you don't have enough generation. So when you decide suddenly that, hey, I have to curtail you because I do have that out, given how the policies are worked, what happens is it erodes trust on both sides, and basically I think renders the investments that were built for that purpose, not for that purpose, not built for reliability, but the investments that could also bring additional benefits renders them less effective. And so I think, you know, that should be another example of how I think research and good policy research, or research that leads to good policy recommendations could help. In this case, Texas and Mexico. Of course, you know, Texas wants to have a bigger presence in Mexico, and I think we can have that bigger presence. But I think there will be some things that are non-starters in Mexico today. And with this government, probably the first one is, you're not going to tell me what to do. Sovereignty, as you both quoted, is important, very close to the heart of the president. So what type of policy and recommendations can be crafted so that that sovereignty remains as is, but it helps the president basically and the government, or the governor here and the president here, attract more investments, optimize the infrastructure, and continue building a stronger and more secure, you know, relationship, you know, in North America, in this case, in between Texas and Mexico. So I leave it there. You know, I hopefully didn't extend too much, but I leave it there and see what y'all think.
Oh, it's pretty good. I don't know if you guys want to comment something, or if we jump right into, we have a couple of questions. So if you want to go ahead.
I can say just a couple things. I mean, one is I thought it was, I do think it's extremely important for the US's trade partners, and this is something I find myself talking about with Canadians all the time. It is important to understand that sometimes it just is frankly a different standard for investment in Mexico or Canada than it is for the United States, by which I mean investors are willing to put up with a lot of legal uncertainty in the United States that they would not put up with from any other country, because they already have a legal team in the United States that understands, okay, you can bring this kind of claim in state court, this kind of claim in federal court, you can use eminent domain against this kind of a landowner, but not that kind of landowner, the complexities, et cetera. And I think sometimes Canadians, you know, are frustrated and they say, well, you know, our system is no more complicated than the United States. But, you know, the reality is for a lot of global investors, the United States is a must-have in their portfolio, and Canada or Mexico is a, well, you know, good to have, or potentially looking for opportunities. But it just means that there's a higher standard in terms of legal certainty that is required. So, you know, it's not that the US gets all the investment because there's the most legal uncertainty here. There's lots of legal uncertainty. But it's simply a factor of there's so much investment here that people are willing to learn the ins and outs of what's frankly a very convoluted legal process.
And just, I think Enrique said something very important that sometimes we miss, and especially I would say many lawyers have this bias. That is, oh, you know, there's a breach of contract. Lawsuits are coming. There's going to be a tsunami of cases against Mexico. Prepare yourselves. This is going to go down. From the business perspective, litigation is always the last resource, right? Companies are not in the business of bringing claims against governments. Let me put it that way, right? Companies are going to try to figure out whether there are other opportunities. I mean, there's a change of administration. It's normal. It's not the first time that an energy company has faced changes of administration, right, Enrique? It is one of the most common things that happen. And it's just about mitigating risk and figuring out how you're going to deal with the new person in power. So if they can still make a buck, even if it's not the same, even if you have to restructure certain things, if you can still make a buck and get some rate of return, they're going to sit down and try to negotiate, right? They're going to figure out whether this is still worth pursuing. In the terms of the new administration, so that the new administration can put on the cloak and say, we defended our resources, but, you know, we forced the companies to sit down and negotiate, even if in the long run might be, you know, balance off, things be equal, right? But this is a very important point, because lawyers tend to overemphasize the remedies, and they go all over the place saying this is going to be the most expensive process. Just to give an example, the case of Venezuela, right? That Hugo Chavez, it was even more outrageous, right? In what the pompousness and everything that happened in Venezuela. Even in the case of Venezuela, the 38 contracts that were signed during the Apertura Petrolera of the 90s, only 2 ended up in litigation. All the other ones were renegotiated. The companies migrated to the new regime associated with PDVSA. They weren't happy. I mean, they weren't excited, but they stayed, right? There were only two, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, decided to bring out the big guns. And look at the story. Look at it went. They said they're still haven't been able to recover the damages, and that the actions were taken in 2007, right? So when companies see that, they're saying, you know, I'm not. You know, it's never a good business when your business strategy is to bring claims against the government. And correct me if I'm wrong, Enrique, but I think that's one of the big takeaways also from.
No, I agree 100%. I mean, if your plan is to go into a dubious fiscal term country or a dubious fiscal, you know, legal framework, invest in a dubious, you know, like gray area, because then you're going to sue and get your money out of that. Then you're in the wrong business. You should be in a different business, right? Not in the businesses that we're you know, presuming that we're all in, which is a, you know, stable long-term infrastructure building. And I do think that that's what, particularly in this case, the Mexican government suspects, or at least their gut tells them the companies are not going to run that risk. You know, they don't want to burn a bridge in Mexico. I do think that the current administration thinks that they're going to be there for 50 years. You know, and so you don't want to burn a bridge with. Maybe you want to burn a bridge with me. I'm the president today, but guess what? My predecessors and my predecessors, I mean, my successors and successors are going to be here, and they'll remember. And that means that you're never going to do business here ever again. Because if it's one thing that's for sure is that there's memory in this government, and they're willing to point out that you made my life hard in the past, so I'm going to make your life hard going forward. So yeah, and Mexico is no different than other regions in the world. And
okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. We're going to jump into the first question. Could you please talk about the legal framework for wind energy between Texas and Mexico? Is there one in place already, or are there any plans to establish one?
So the short answer is no. I mean, I think it's important to understand that the United States doesn't have a wind energy framework even for between the US states. So if you really wanted to take advantage of low cost wind power, which exists basically between North Dakota and the Texas Panhandle, you'd really have to export that to states a little bit to the east and the Midwest and the Southeast. And for the most part, nobody's been able to build those power lines because we don't have an integrated energy strategy. Now, with all that said, there's incredible opportunity there, both domestically, but also across the border with West Texas wind energy going south to Mexico, and sort of Tamaulipas wind energy going north to Texas. So there is a possibility for that bilateral, but there's not structure supported. And I think Guillermo would also talk about some of the change. I mean, if anything, policy in Mexico seems to be going against renewable energy providers, and maybe he wants to say something about that.
So I'll say something quickly. So in Mexico, the way the structure, the energy was structured was they really wanted to bring more renewables, right? And they came and they started building the wind farms and the solar panels. One of the issues was, how do you bring that energy into the existing grid, right? So they actually had to pay, because CFE still has monopoly on the transmission. So some of the companies, some of the deals that they had to come up with when private parties started to participate is that they basically built the transmission lines to connect to the grid and gave it back to CFE, right? Because CFE didn't have the capital to build them. And that's one of the things that they're complaining now, that they're, the president is saying, oh, they're abusing CFE, and the companies are like, what are you talking about? We also help you to expand, the grid, because you weren't going to do it. So that kind of infrastructure, I think right now companies are not going to keep expanding it because of the current atmosphere, right? Because their expectation was, we're going to be feeding the grid first. That was the rules of the dispatch. And so they were able to build it in a lower cost than CFE. Now with the new rule, they go back in the line. And that means that there's actually no incentive to expanding the existing infrastructure. So unless there is a plan to use that existing infrastructure, electricity production, and then ship it, export it to the US, that could be one way of solving the issue, right? Maybe AMLO doesn't want to have CFE to compete, but I'm sure, again, this is another example. if you sell it as we're actually going to be exported to the US and you're going to be paying CFE for the use of the transmission, that might be a business opportunity for the current administration that wouldn't jeopardize CFE's monopoly, right? So again, that's an opportunity, but they haven't. I think going back a little bit to what Enrique said before, I mean, one of the biggest mistakes, I think, or at least not mistakes, one of the things that is missing from the AMLO administration is to realize the interconnectedness, right? As opposed to thinking they're coming here to take away our resources, they should be thinking, how can we make a business with the US, right? Because we already have some interconnection. It's just a matter of how we can sell it within this paradigm of sovereignty, right? And benefit, right? Mexico could have benefited, for example, from the principles established in the US-Mexico-Canada side agreement. The fact that Governor Abbott was able to ban, quote unquote, ban the export of gas into Mexico also made it easier because there was nothing in the treaty about it, right? We now have, they could have, the side letters does have those kind of commitments to allow non-discriminatory actions against your party. So Mexico could be thinking, if I'm depending already on the gas, I might as well protect my quote unquote investments on the US side so that gas gets secure, and we know that it's not going to happen again. That just a Texas governor is going to say, no, I don't want to allow these gas to leave the state. So I'll leave it there.
Let me say one more thing because it ties into something that Enrique also said earlier, which is I think it's really important to understand there are incredible opportunities in transport of both natural gas and power, but those are fundamentally different than the historical trade in oil and coal. And that's because these cleaner sources, natural gas and power, it requires multi-decade infrastructure that just sits in one place and you can't change it. So, it's like people say words, diamonds are forever or whatever. Natural gas transport and electric power transport, that is forever because, as Enrique says, if that natural gas link went down, the power goes out in Mexico, people don't have heat in Mexico, and then in Texas, you would have the price fall below zero of natural gas, and you would double your flaring. I mean, it's truly catastrophic impacts on both sides of the border. And the same thing is true for power transport across the border. So it's a long-term investment with potentially high risk, but once it's made, as we have several natural gas pipelines, that's a permanent energy relationship that there's really no getting out of.
Yeah, my addition is along those lines. That if you already have infrastructure like the ones we're referring to today are natural monopolies. I mean, you're not going to build two transmission lines when one can do the work. So in this case, if you already have a gas pipeline that crosses the border, or you already have a transmission line that crosses the border, the natural thing to do is to look at ways to expanding that capacity, because it will be the less disruptive on the right of way. Whoever is operating it probably already operates it efficiently, so it's not even incremental. It's only slightly incremental. So, but how are you going to do that? You cannot ask Texas ratepayers to front the cost of the existing emergency ties, which are sometimes used for commercial transport, because it's not fair, right? Why should I, as a ratepayer, subsidize the power that's going to Mexico if it's costing me, right? So that's a fair position. But what if the expansions or the new infrastructure is built thinking that part of it could be fronted by the ratepayers, and part of it could be fronted by, or the remainder, maybe the majority, could be fronted by Mexico, for instance. And why would Mexico do it? Because guess what? It's easier to pay for $100 million on a transmission line and access the ERCOT market that's deep, assuming everything else is fixed, and rather than building a generation plant down there, right? And that's an example that has been discussed over the years, in particular. But when it comes to the regulations and when it comes to the policy, it's not there. The frameworks are not there. The politics obviously are part of center. In this case, they're polarized. Mexico's on one side, the US is on the other side, or Texas on the other side. And then of course you have all other sorts of federal and state relationships when it comes to Texas and power. So I would say that the most efficient for both countries, or in this case for both regions, would be to let's sit down, and as James and Guillermo are pointing out, and let's look at the whole interconnectivity of the border and how can we optimize and make it more efficient. What do we need to change? But to do that, you need to first lower the tone of the dialogue and rather start pointing names and saying, "Oh, you stop the gas flow, or you're killing my investments on there." Okay, let's sit down and find out if this is just a resetting of our relationship. That's to your point. That's innocuous because companies and investors are going to adapt to the new reality, right? And those that don't want to invest in the country, they can leave. They can. I mean, it's harsh, and I know it's not what people want to think, but they can take the money and liquidate their assets and find new investment opportunities. And it's not easy to do it, but they can do it. I mean, it's not like they're locked in Mexico forever or they're locked in the U.S. forever. And I think that's what's going on in Mexico City, right? Those that don't want to do business as I want it to do, because that's the way I think this country should go, they're free to go back. And that's not what we like to hear as investors, but that's right now the starting point.
We have time for one more question, and I'm going to go into this one, asking you as well to take it as the final comment for this webinar. We had a blackout recently. Most of us Texans felt it, and it was felt also in Mexico. This question goes to that. The deep freeze in Texas not only affected people in Texas, it also affected people in Mexico. What effect will this have on renewable energy investments in Mexico? And I would say, gentlemen, if you can give your closing thoughts in terms of integration as well. What can we do moving forward and into the future to kind of help each other prevent even future situations like this?
I'll take a 30-second look. I think the blackout probably did not help much the renewable sector in Mexico, at least, because what it and maybe not even here in Texas, because what it showed is that there has to be a more reliable infrastructure, more dependable. And renewables, unfortunately, at least today, are not dispatchable as thermal generation is. Gas and coal and nuclear, you can easily turn on those plants if there's gas and coal and fuel available. But you can't tell the wind to blow whenever you want it, and you can't tell the sun, hey, can you continue shining a couple of hours more beyond dusk, so that we can keep the power flowing. So I think it's going to make a little harder, at least in Mexico, to support the case if you argue that the blackout will open up opportunities.
So I think that the blackout didn't help renewables in Mexico because they blamed. So there were two bad people in the story, at least on the Mexican side. One was the Texans. We depend too much on Texas gas, and the Texans are blocking our gas, and so they are to blame about it. And then the other problem was the wind farms, which doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, in Mexico, the renewable companies, they were still producing electricity. I mean, the thing is that they're not in a stage where they can take over, most of the grid for the reasons that Enrique is saying. But they weren't that as affected as the wind farms in Texas. And even in the case of Texas, I mean, one of the first ones that came up online were the wind farms, right? It wasn't that they went out of power for the whole week. They started producing early on. So I think in that sense, at least in the narrative, they are being blamed, even though I would say some of those things are not. It wasn't their fault, right? So on the other hand, to be honest, I think in the long run, if Mexico wants to depend less on Texas gas, they need to expand their renewables and they need to expand their gas production in Mexico. There is very few scenarios that I see in which Mexico can actually sustainably, right, and keeping their carbon production low, right? Let's say they're going to also comply with the Paris Agreement, because the other option is start burning coal or start burning oil, and that means that you're going to be. It's more expensive. You're polluting more. Yes, you might benefit Pemex, because they're using, Pemex's oil in order to burn and produce electricity. But in the long run, if Mexico really wants to get away from depending on Texas gas, renewables could be one of that part of the equation, right? The other piece is you have to do some fracking in Mexico, and there is gas in Mexico. I mean, the Borges Basin, Cachicontepec, the Tampico. But the problem with the current administration narrative is that they don't want to do fracking, they don't want to expand the renewables, but they don't want to depend on natural gas from Texas. So you're leaving only one alternative again, which is coal and burning oil, right? And I think that's the only thing that is. So I think, they didn't fail because of the narrative, but I think I said more than I should have.
Yeah, I would just say that there's two reasons that we've had increased installation of wind and solar. One is sometimes it makes economic sense because we save, when we run those sources, if they're very cheap, we save on natural gas that we would otherwise have to burn. So we save the expense of those fuels. And so sometimes it makes economic sense, but really the majority of expansion of renewables we've seen is because we're paying for environmental performance. We don't want any air emissions, any carbon emissions. And so we're subsidizing those sources to avoid those. Now the problem, and frankly, this is a problem not just with the Texas blackout, but with the pandemic. When that Texas blackout hit, your first thought should have been, we are not as rich as we thought we were, right? And it's the same thing with the pandemic, because we realized that we were, skimping on things that we really should have been paying for all along. And we're going to have to pay to ensure that our system can provide reliable power, that this never happens again. This was a truly catastrophic level of blackout. About 1,000 times as much power was lost here as was lost in California, and the blackouts that made the news this past summer. This is a catastrophic level. It can't happen again, and we're going to have to pay money to fix it. And when we pay money to fix that, just like paying money to fix the pandemic, that means less money for every other priority. And renewables and reducing our carbon emissions are one of those priorities that something has to give. So it's not. We'll still see expansion of renewables. That's not going to stop. And I think the world has important climate goals that's to work, but this will slow down that progress towards adopting more renewables.
Well, thank you. Thank you, the three of you. Thank you, James, Guillermo, and Enrique, for joining us today. Our time is up. We'd like to thank you for joining us for this very insightful talk about energy. Certainly very many more things to think about. And we'd like to thank everybody who joined us today. And we'd love to remind you that the following Fridays, we have more engaging conversations at the Texas Mexico Center as part of our symposium. That about wraps it up for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and hope to see you next Friday. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you to the center.